If you are feeling tired, confused, and constantly second-guessing yourself after a relationship, you are not imagining things. That heavy exhaustion you carry is real. It comes from spending months, sometimes years, trying to decode someone else's moods while quietly shrinking your own needs to keep the peace. You learned to read the air in the room before you even spoke. You learned to soften your tone, change your subject, or step back entirely because you never knew when a simple comment would turn into an explosion. You kept asking yourself what you did wrong. You kept looking for the missing piece of yourself that would finally make everything stable. But there was no missing piece. You were not the problem. The instability was built into the dynamic from the beginning. You were navigating a relationship where your calm was treated as permission, and your honesty was treated as a threat. The confusion you feel now is not a sign of weakness. It is the natural result of living in an environment where reality was constantly shifted, and your role was to absorb the impact. When you step back and look at what actually happened, a clear pattern emerges. This was not a normal cycle of disagreements and repairs. This was a system designed to keep you off balance. At the center of that system was anger. It was not just occasional frustration or healthy disagreement. It was a consistent tool. Anger became the default response, the first line of defense, and the loudest voice in the room. Understanding why anger was used so frequently is not about making excuses for it. It is about removing the mystery so you can stop blaming yourself for something you could never control. Anger, in this context, was never really about what happened in the moment. It was about control. It was about fear. It was about maintaining a specific emotional hierarchy where one person held the power to dictate the mood, and the other person was responsible for managing it. Once you see anger for what it actually was, the confusion starts to lift. You stop asking why you could not keep the peace, and you start recognizing that peace was never the goal. Compliance was. Think about how often the anger appeared out of nowhere. A small question, a harmless observation, a request for clarity, and suddenly the temperature in the room dropped. The reaction never matched the trigger. You were left scrambling to figure out what you said, how you said it, and how you could fix it. This sudden shift served a very specific psychological purpose. When anger arrives without warning, it bypasses your logical thinking and activates your nervous system. You move into survival mode. You stop focusing on your own perspective and start focusing on de-escalation. That is exactly how the dynamic works. The unpredictability keeps you in a constant state of readiness. You learn to monitor their body language, their tone, their silence, because you are trained to believe that your safety and emotional stability depend on your ability to prevent the next outburst. Over time, this rewires your natural responses. You begin to suppress your own needs because asserting them feels too dangerous. You apologize for things that were not your fault. You take responsibility for their mood. The cost of this is your sense of reality. You start trusting their emotional reactions more than your own judgment. But the truth is simple. Healthy relationships do not require constant vigilance. You were not walking on eggshells because you were fragile. You were walking on eggshells because the floor was deliberately uneven. There is another layer to how anger functioned in your relationship. It was often used to shift focus away from accountability. Whenever a real issue came up, whenever you pointed out a pattern or asked for consistency, the conversation would quickly turn toward your tone, your timing, or your past mistakes. The anger would roll in like a wall. It did not matter what you actually said. The moment discomfort arose, anger became the shield. Psychologically, this is a defense mechanism, but in this context, it is weaponized. It redirects the energy away from the person who needs to look at themselves and places it squarely on you. Instead of discussing the behavior, you end up defending your right to speak. Instead of addressing the broken promise, you are managing the fallout of their reaction. This creates a loop where nothing ever gets resolved. You leave the conversation feeling guilty, exhausted, and somehow responsible for the entire mess. But you were not responsible for the deflection. You were just caught in the crossfire. Anger in this situation was not a sign of passion or investment. It was a strategy to avoid vulnerability. Looking inward requires honesty. It requires admitting fault. It requires sitting with discomfort without rushing to fix it or blame someone else. When someone cannot tolerate that discomfort, they use anger to silence the conversation. You learn to drop your boundaries because raising them meant facing a storm. That is not love. That is emotional avoidance dressed up as intensity. Over time, you likely noticed that anger was not just reactive. It was instructional. It taught you what was allowed and what was not. Certain topics became off-limits. Certain feelings were dismissed as overreactions. Certain requests were met with coldness or sudden irritation. This is how compliance is built. Not through clear communication, but through consequence. When a specific behavior consistently leads to an angry outburst, your brain learns to associate that behavior with danger. You begin to self-edit. You stop bringing up certain things. You stop sharing certain thoughts. You start filtering yourself before you even open your mouth. This is a form of behavioral conditioning, and it happens quietly. You do not realize it at first. You just notice that you feel smaller, quieter, and more careful. You tell yourself you are being more mature or more considerate. But maturity does not require self-erasure. Consideration does not require silence. What you were experiencing was a quiet training process. Anger was the boundary setter, but it was not a healthy boundary. It was a wall built to keep you in a manageable role. The person using it did not need you to be equal. They needed you to be predictable. They needed you to be accommodating. They needed you to absorb their frustration so they would never have to face their own. Every time you backed down, every time you apologized to restore calm, the pattern was reinforced. You were not failing at communication. You were succeeding at survival in an environment that punished authenticity. When you put these pieces together, the picture becomes very clear. The anger was not about you. It was never about your flaws or your mistakes. It was a system of control that relied on your empathy, your patience, and your willingness to keep trying. You kept trying because that is what good people do. You believed that if you just understood the pattern, you could fix it. You believed that love meant staying through the hard parts. But there is a difference between hard parts and harmful patterns. Hard parts can be worked through with mutual respect. Harmful patterns only grow when one person carries the entire emotional weight. Recognizing this is not an act of blame. It is an act of clarity. You can look back now and see exactly where your energy went. You can see how much of your life was spent managing someone else's emotional weather. You can see how your own needs were quietly set aside while you tried to keep the peace. That awareness is the turning point. It is the moment you stop asking what you could have done differently and start recognizing what you should have been allowed to experience all along. You deserved consistency. You deserved calm. You deserved a relationship where your voice did not trigger a crisis. The fact that you did not get that is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of the limitations of the person you were dealing with. Clarity naturally leads to a different way of moving forward. You do not need to fight back. You do not need to prove your point. You do not need to explain yourself to someone who has already decided not to listen. What you need is distance. Not necessarily physical distance, though that can be necessary. What you need first is emotional distance. You need to step out of the role you were assigned. You need to stop treating their anger as a signal that you failed and start treating it as information about their own capacity. When you see anger for what it is, it loses its power to dictate your mood. You stop jumping to fix it. You stop taking it personally. You stop measuring your worth by how calm you can keep them. This is where boundaries begin. Boundaries are not threats. They are not ultimatums. They are quiet decisions about what you will and will not participate in. You decide that you will not engage in conversations that are designed to make you defend your reality. You decide that you will not absorb emotional outbursts that have nothing to do with you. You decide that your peace is more important than keeping someone else comfortable at your expense. This shift feels unfamiliar at first. You might feel guilt. You might feel like you are being cold or unfeeling. But detachment is not cruelty. It is self-preservation. It is the realization that you cannot manage someone else's emotions, and you are not responsible for doing so. When you stop feeding the cycle eventually runs out of energy. You are no longer available to be trained. You are no longer available to be redirected. You are simply present, grounded, and clear about where you stand. Healing begins the moment you stop trying to decode the anger and start trusting your own experience. You do not need to wait for an apology to know what you went through. You do not need validation from the person who caused the confusion to trust your own memory. Your exhaustion is real. Your confusion was real. Your desire for peace was real, and none of it was misplaced. You entered the relationship with good intentions. You brought empathy. You brought patience. You brought a willingness to work through difficulty. Those qualities are not weaknesses. They are strengths that were simply used against you in an environment that could not handle them. Now you get to redirect them. You get to bring that same care back to yourself. You get to rebuild your relationship with your own voice, your own boundaries, and your own sense of safety. It takes time. The nervous system needs time to settle after years of constant alert. You might still feel tension when someone raises their voice. You might still catch yourself apologizing when you have done nothing wrong. These are echoes, not failures. They fade as you practice living in your own truth. You learn to pause before reacting. You learn to recognize when a conversation is heading toward manipulation and choose to step away. You learn to sit with silence instead of filling it with explanations. You learn to trust your instincts again. This is what freedom looks like. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is quiet, steady, and deeply your own. You are not broken. You were stretched beyond your limits by someone who could not regulate their own emotions. You survived it. You are learning from it. And you are moving forward with a clearer mind, a calmer heart, and a firm understanding of what you will and will not accept. The anger was their weapon. Your peace is your protection. Keep it. Guard it. Build your life around it. You have already done the hardest part, which is seeing through the confusion. Now you get to live in the clarity, and that clarity will guide you back to yourself, one steady step at a time.